Book of Heaven, Volume 18, Part 3. October 21st, 1925. Effects of one act in the divine will. The sorrow of Jesus is suspended in the divine will, waiting for the sinner. This morning on coming, my sweet Jesus told me, "My daughter, I bring you the kiss of all heaven." And as he was saying this, he kissed me and added, "All of heaven is in my will, and because they are in this supreme volition, whatever I do, they feel the echo of my acts, and as though responding to my echo, they repeat what I do." Having said this, he disappeared, but after a few hours he came back, telling me, "My daughter, return to me the kiss I gave you, because all of heaven, my mamma, our celestial Father, and the divine Spirit are awaiting the requital of your kiss. Because since an act of theirs has come out in my will toward the creature who lives in the exile, they yearn for the requital of it, to be returned to them in my same will." So as he drew his mouth close to mine, almost trembling, I gave him my kiss. That produced a harmonious sound never before heard, that rose up high and diffused in everything and to everyone. And Jesus, with unspeakable love, added, "How beautiful are the acts in my will! Ah, you do not know the power, the greatness, the marvel of one act in my will. This act moves everything, heaven and earth, as if they were one single act, and all creation, the angels, the saints, give and receive the return of that act. Therefore, an act done in my will cannot be without return. Otherwise, all would feel the sorrow of a divine act that has moved everyone putting of his own into it, and yet it is not requited. The operating of the soul in my will is like the silvery sound of a vibrant and shrill bell that sounds so loudly as to call the attention of all, and it sounds and sounds again so sweetly that all recognize at that sound the operating of the soul in my will, all receiving the glory and the honor of a divine act." Having said this, he disappeared. Then I was continuing the fusing of myself in the divine will, feeling sorrow for each offense that has ever been given to my Jesus, from the first to the last man who shall come upon earth. And while feeling sorrow, I asked for forgiveness. But while I was doing this, I said to myself, "My Jesus, my love, it is not enough for me to feel sorrow and to ask for forgiveness, but I would like to annihilate any sin, so that you may never, never again be offended." And Jesus, moving in my interior, told me, "My daughter, I had a special sorrow for each sin, and upon my sorrow hung the pardon for the sinner. Now, this sorrow of mine is suspended in my will, waiting for the sinner when he offends me, so that as he feels sorrow for having offended me, my sorrow may descend to feel sorrow together with his, and immediately grant him forgiveness. But how many offend me and do not feel sorrow? So my sorrow and forgiveness are suspended in my will, and as though isolated. Thank you, my daughter, for coming into my will to keep company with my sorrow and with my forgiveness. Please continue to make your round in my will, and making my sorrow your own, cry out for each offense, sorrow, forgiveness, so that I may not be the only one who feels sorrow and impetrates forgiveness, but I may have the company of the little daughter of my will, who feels sorrow together with me. October 24th, 1925. The divine will is one single act, immense and eternal, that contains altogether creation, redemption, and sanctification. The one who lives in the divine will possesses this single act and takes part in all its works, forming one single act with her God. As I was in my usual state, I felt my sweet Jesus move in my interior, in the act of laying himself within me, as if he were placing himself in agony. I could hear his rattle of agony, and I too felt I was agonizing together with him. Then, after I had suffered for a little while together with Jesus, he said to me, "My daughter, thinking about my passion, compassionating me in my pains, is very pleasing to me. I feel I am not alone in my pains, but I have with me the company of the creature, because of whom I suffer and whom I love so much. And as I have her with me, my suffering becomes sweeter for me. How hard is isolation and suffering! When I see myself alone, I have no one to whom to entrust my pains, nor anyone to whom to give the fruit that my pains contain. And so I remain as though drowned with pains and love. Therefore, as my love can endure no more, I come to you, to suffer within you, and you with me, the pains of my passion, in act, in order to repeat what I did and suffered in my humanity. To repeat my passion in act in the creature is different from one who only thinks about and compassionates my pains. The first is an act of my life that takes my place in order to repeat my pains. And I feel I am given back the effects and the value of a divine life. On the other hand, when one thinks about my pains and compassionates me, it is the mere company of the creature that I feel. But do you know in whom I can repeat the pains of my passion in act? In the one who has my will as center of life. My will alone is one single act that has no succession of acts. This single act is as though fixed to one point that never moves, and this point is eternity. And while being one single act, prime act, endless act, its circumference is so immense that nothing can escape it. It embraces everything and everyone with one single embrace, because everything starts from that prime act as one single act. So, the creation, the redemption, and the sanctification are one single act for the divinity, and only because it is one single act, it has the power to make all acts its own, as if they were one alone. Now, the one who lives in my will possesses this single act, and it is no wonder that she takes part in the pains of my passion, as though in act. In this single act, she finds, as though in act, her Creator creating the creation. And forming one single act with her God, she creates together with Him, flowing as one single act in all created things, and forming the glory of creation for her Creator. Her love shines over all created things. She enjoys and takes pleasure in them. She loves them as things belonging to herself and to her God. In that single act, she has a note that echoes the whole of the divine operating. And in her emphasis of love, she says, "What is yours is mine, and what is mine is yours. Be glory, honor, and love to my Creator." In this single act, she finds the redemption in act. She makes it all her own. She suffers my pains as if they were her own. She flows within everything I did, in my prayers, in my pains, in my words, in everything. She has a note of reparation, of compassion, of love, and of substitution for my life. In this single act, she finds everything. She makes everything her own, and places her requital of love everywhere. This is why the living in my will is the prodigy of prodigies. It is the enchantment of God and of all heaven, as they see the littleness of the creature flow in all the things of their Creator. Like solar ray, bound to this single act, she diffuses everywhere and in every one. Therefore I recommend to you, even at the cost of your life, never go out of this single act of my will, that I may repeat in you, as though in act, the creation, the redemption, and the sanctification. See, also nature contains the similes of this single act. In the atmosphere, the sun has one single act. From the moment it was created by God, it always does one single act. Its light, its heat, are so transfused together as to become inseparable from each other, and from up high it remains always in the act of sending light and heat. And while from up high it knows how to do but one single act, the circumference of its light that descends down below is so great as to embrace all the earth, and with its embrace it produces innumerable effects, constituting itself life and glory of all created things. By virtue of this single act, it has the virtue of enclosing each plant within itself, and to some it administers development, to some maturation of fruits, to some sweetness, to some fragrance. It can be said that the whole earth begs life from the sun, and that each plant, even the littlest blade of grass, from the sun beseeches its growth and each fruit it must produce. But the sun never changes its action. It glories in doing always one single act. The human nature also contains the simile of one single act, and this is contained in the beating of the heart. Human life begins with the heartbeat. The heartbeat does always one single act. It can do nothing but beating. However, the virtue of this heartbeat, its effects in the human life, are innumerable. As it palpitates, and at each heartbeat, it makes the blood circulate in the members, up to the outermost parts, And as it palpitates, it gives strength to the feet in order to walk, to the hands in order to work, to the mouth in order to speak, to the mind in order to think. It administers warmth and strength to the whole person. Everything depends on the heartbeat, so much so that if the heartbeat is a little labored, one loses energy and the will to operate. The intelligence becomes dim. One is full of pains, a general ill-being. And if the heartbeat ceases, life ceases. The power of a single act repeated continuously is great, much more so for the single act of an eternal God who has the virtue of doing everything with one single act. Therefore, neither past, nor present, nor future exist in this act, and the one who lives in my will already finds herself in this single act. And just as the heart does always a heartbeat in the human nature that constitutes itself life of it, so does my will palpitate continuously in the depth of the soul, but with one single heartbeat. And as it palpitates, it gives her beauty, sanctity, strength, love, goodness, wisdom. This heartbeat encloses heaven and earth. It is like blood circulation, like circumference of light. It can be found in the highest points and in the outermost parts. Wherever this single act, this heartbeat of the soul, has full vigor and reigns completely, there is a continuous prodigy, the prodigy that only a God can do, and therefore new heavens, new abysses of graces, surprising truths are discovered in her. But if one asks, where does so much good come from? She would answer, united with the sun, together with the human heartbeat, and with the single act of the eternal God, I do only one thing. I do always the will of God, and I live in it. This is all my secret, and all my fortune. Having said this, he disappeared, but later I found myself outside of myself, with little baby Jesus in my arms. He was very pale. He was shivering all over. His lips were blue, and he was cold and so emaciated as to arouse pity. It seemed to me that he had taken refuge in my arms in order to be defended. I pressed him to my heart to warm him. I took his little hands and feet in my hands, and I squeezed them so that he would not shiver. I kissed him and kissed him over and over again. I told him that I loved him very, very much. And while I was doing this, the little baby regained color. He stopped shivering. He was all restored, and he clung more tightly to me. But while I thought that he would remain always with me, to my surprise, I saw that, very gently, he was going down from my knees. I cried out, pulling him by one arm, "Jesus, where are you going? How can this be? You leave me?" And he, "I must go." And I, "And when are you coming back?" And Jesus, "In 3 years from now." And he took his way to leave. But who can say my sorrow? I repeated to myself among tears and convulsions, "I shall see him again in 3 years from now. Oh God, how shall I go on?" and the pain was so great that I fainted and could not understand anything any more. But while I was languishing, faint, I just barely opened my eyes, and I saw that he had turned back and was coming up from my other knee. And very gently, he crouched down on my lap, and he caressed me with his little hands. He kissed me and repeated to me, calm yourself, for I do not leave you." And as he would say, "I do not leave you," I would feel myself come round and life given back to me. And I found myself inside myself, but with such fear that I felt myself dying. November 1st, 1925. The pain of the privation of Jesus surpasses the very pains of hell. What it means to suffer in the divine will. I went through most bitter days without my sweet Jesus. The thought of not seeing him any more hammered my poor heart like an anvil, with repeated cruel hammer blows. Ah, Jesus, you have put me in a living hell. Even more, my pains surpass the very infernal pains. Ah, the damned do not love you, and since the seed of love is missing, they run away from you, nor do they long for your embrace. Their pains would become harsher with your presence. A love that is hated cannot stand the presence of the person who is hated. Therefore, for them, your privation is more bearable. But for me, unhappy one, it is all the opposite. I love you. I feel the seed of love deep inside my bones, in my nerves, in my blood. Ah, don't you remember that, having lived together for as long as 40 years, you filled my bones, my nerves, my blood, all of myself with yourself? I felt like a garment that covered you and concealed you within me. And now, without you, I feel emptied of everything. So my bones cry out, my nerves and my blood cry out, for they want he who used to fill them. There is a continuous cry inside me that lacerates me, tortures me, for they want you who used to fill my life. Do you see, then, how many cruel tearings my poor existence suffers? Ah, in hell, there aren't these atrocious pains, these cruel tearings, this void of a God possessed and loved. Ah, Jesus, come back to the one who loves you. Come back to the unhappy one among the unhappy, but rendered unhappy only for you, only because of you. I can say this: you alone have rendered me unhappy. Other unhappinesses I do not know. Now, while I was swimming in the bitter sea of the privation of my Jesus, I began to consider the pains of the heart of my Jesus, to make a comparison with the pains of my poor heart. But instead of finding comfort in the pains of Jesus, my pains became harsher, thinking to myself that my pains surpassed the pains of my Jesus, because, as great as they were, the pains of the heart of Jesus were pains given to him by creatures, and even if ungrateful they offend him and run away from him, They are always finite creatures, not the infinite being. But for me these are pains that a God gives me. It is not a creature that runs away from me, but a God, the infinite being. Jesus does not have another God who might leave him, nor can he have him. Therefore he cannot suffer the pain that surpasses every pain, that of being without a God. Instead, my pain of being without a God is great, is infinite, as great and infinite as God is. Ah, his pierced heart has not suffered this pain, and the piercing of the pain of the divine privation is missing in his pierced heart. And besides, as many pains as creatures might give him, my Jesus never loses his sovereignty, his dominion, even over those who offend him. Neither do they make him smaller, nor do they fade him. He loses nothing of what he is. He is always dominant over all. He is always the eternal, immense, infinite, lovable and adorable being. But as for me, I do not have sovereignty, nor dominion. And by being without Jesus, I become smaller. I fade. I feel reduced to nothing. I become nauseating and unbearable, even to myself. See then, O Jesus, how my pains are greater than yours. Ah, you know the pains that creatures give you, but do not know the pains that a God can give, and how heavy is your privation. My poor mind was speaking nonsense. I felt that there was no pain that could be compared to the pain of the privation of Jesus. It is a pain without beginning and without end, incalculable and irreparable. That which Jesus is, such becomes the pain. My poor heart was drowned and without life. And in order not to speak more nonsense, I forced myself to stop comparing my pains with those of Jesus, and to move on to something else. Only I prayed that he would give me strength, and since the pain of his privation was so great, and had a mysterious and divine sound that other pains do not have, and a weight that surpasses the weight of all other pains together, I prayed that by his goodness he would accept my pain, and in view of it, he would grant me the greatest grace, that all may know his most holy will, and with its mysterious and divine sound, it may resound in all hearts, and call everyone to fulfill the most holy will, crushing with its weight the human will, the passions, and sin, so that all may know you, love you, and comprehend what the loss of a God means. But who can say all that I was thinking? I would be too long. Rather, I would have wanted to keep everything in silence, and not to entrust my secrets to the paper. But obedience imposed itself, and I had to say Fiat. Then I felt exhausted, and I could take no more. And my sweet Jesus, having compassion for me, came out from my interior, all labored, with his mouth all filled with blood. The blood was so much that it prevented him from speaking. But with his sad gaze, he asked for my help. Before the pains of Jesus, I forgot about my own. Even more, since he was present, I had no more pain. and I prayed him to let us suffer together. Then, after we suffered together for a little while, the blood from his mouth stopped, and looking at the way I had reduced myself because of his privation, he clasped me to himself. He laid himself within me in order to fill me with himself. And then he told me, "Poor daughter, how you have reduced yourself. You are right. The pain of the privation of a God is the greatest pain. And because it is great, it took all the strength of my will to sustain you. But you do not know what it means to suffer in my will. Wherever my will was, there ran your pain, on earth, in heaven, within the saints and the angels. And as it reached them, all placed themselves in the act of looking at you and of helping you. So all were turned toward you, and if paradise were capable of suffering, it would have changed all of their joys and happinesses into sorrow. But since it is not capable of suffering, all beseeched graces in exchange for a pain so great. The pains of the soul who lives in my will are the cross of all. They satisfy for everything, and convert the fury of divine justice into celestial dew. Therefore pluck up courage and never want to go out of my will." I remained confounded. I was expecting a reproach from Jesus because of my nonsense, but nothing. And we remained in perfect peace. You have reached the end of the Book of Heaven, Volume 18, Part 3. Fiat.